We will now proceed with the discussion on the second topic, political developments in 2022 ahead of GE15, which will be moderated by Mr. Halmi Azri Abdul Halim, Research Executive, Democracy and Governance Unit DGU of IDEAS, together with our co-moderator, Mr. Loh Zenting, Research Executive at IDEAS. Without further ado, I would like to invite our moderators together with our esteemed speakers for the second topic, Mr. Ibrahim Sufian, co-founder and director of programs at the Merdeka Center for Opinion Research, and Mr. Thomas Fan, chairman, Coalition for Clean and Fair Elections Bersih, on the stage. Please welcome. For your information, another speaker, Ms. Kira Yusri, co-founder and education director of Undi 18, will be joining us virtually. With that, I would like to pass the session to the moderator, Mr. Halmi.
Hello and good morning to everyone. Hi, I'm Helmi. I'll be standing in line for Ira, our senior manager for the Democracy and Governance Unit. And also today we are very honored and welcome to all of the panelists that we have. So we'll probably start off immediately to talk about the political developments for Malaysia for the year 2022 and beyond. So to contextualize, there are basically a lot of issues. GE is anticipated to be done within the year or so. We are also seen 3 different governments taking place throughout the past 3 years. We are also seeing a lot of realignment in terms of interests and cooperation across the political parties. And also we are seeing governance in terms of COVID-19 and disaster floods. The implementation of Undi 18 is also another significant issue to take into consideration. And there are also ongoing trends whereby offers of reforms are now being mainstreamed to appeal. So everyone's talking about reform. So we would definitely like to have the panelists' view for today's session. We'll start off with Ibrahim Sufian, or better known as Ben, to talk about the emerging political trends, perhaps, and also when we talk about understanding voter patterns, right? Does identity politics still play a role in the Malaysian context? And perhaps you can also share with us and the viewers online on this serious fragmentation occurring across all political spheres. So we'll start off with Ben. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Helmi, and also IDEAS for organizing this conference. I actually prepared a presentation with, I think Jivinia has it, right? So if you can put it up, that would be very helpful. But basically, I think today, or rather this late morning, I am going to touch about 3 topics. Number one is, what is the current context with respect to how do Malaysians overall look at the current situation? Are they happy? Are they not happy? How are they assessing performance of the government overall? And what really is underlying, what really is driving those sentiments? That's more or less a contemporary look. The second aspect, I'm going to speak about the underlying or underpinning factors that drives our politics. So as we know, as Helmi mentioned, identity politics is a big part of it. But that is not all. So I think you have, okay, it's already appeared on the screen. So that is not all. Beyond identity politics, there are certain underlying factors that drives this. In part, it's because of our electoral system, and I think Thomas is going to touch on that. How seats are heavily drawn in favor of certain ethnic groups, certain segments of the population, particularly the rural population. And then beyond that, I think we look at the core underlying factors, which is the socio-economic, and that affects our demographics. And I think by looking at that, perhaps in the future, aspiring politicians, policymakers, as well as activists can begin to understand, how we can navigate our complex political situation and offer solutions for the future. And I think this is instrumental also for younger activists and young aspiring politicians to sort of understand that while we want to have a more equitable, a more multicultural, and more representative Malaysia, there are deep cleavages that bisect our society, that runs along ethnic lines, religious lines, socio-economic lines, as well as regional lines. I won't be able to touch on all of them today. The third part is to give a sense about an outlook. And this is, we can talk about what's happened in Malacca elections, a little bit about Sarawak, and we can gaze into the crystal ball and think about what will happen in Johor, what does it imply for national elections, election timings, and so on. So next slide, please. Next slide. If you can move that. Right, next, after this, so if I've gone through this, okay. This is just an example of when we run the surveys at Merdeka Center. Typically, it's about 1,200 respondents nationwide. We try to sample people from every constituency, parliamentary constituency in the country. So we have, I would say, a fairly representative mix of Malaysians out there. And now that Undi 18 has come into being, and automatic voter registration, we no longer have to segregate between those who are registered and unregistered. Everybody's there. So this recent survey, I think, was up to February. We have a current survey that's currently in the pipeline. It's been affected somewhat by Johor. But anyways, that's a bit of demographics. I've left it with ideas, so you can feel free to share this with your participants and other people. Next slide, please. If you can go to the next slide, then we can look at national direction. Okay, next. Right, so this very long graph is something that tracks basically overall sentiments since 2013. And we have data that goes all the way back to 2003. But it just shows, the red line shows people who feel the country is headed in the wrong direction. Blue line is in the right direction. You can see that for the last maybe 9 years or so, most Malaysians feel the country is headed in the wrong direction as compared to the right direction. The times in which people felt that country was headed in the right direction was very brief moments in time, at the beginnings of each administration. You say the beginning of the Najib administration, it was quite positive. And then when he introduced the GST, things went down. When the 1MDB news broke, it went down even further. And the negative lines was very, very high. And then when things changed over in May 2018, there was an abrupt jump to very positive territory. And then that quickly dissipated over the course of 1 year as it became apparent to members of the public that Pakatan Harapan was not able to deliver on many of its high pie in the sky promises. And then things went down into negative territory again. And then, when the administration shifted to Perikatan Barisan Nasional Coalition under Tan Sri Muhyiddin, again, there is a bump, a positive bump, and you can see that in the 2020 graph line. But then again, after a while, when the political instability and the dissension between Bersatu and UMNO and others begin to come out in the public space, public sentiments went down again. And so now, public mood is for the most part negative. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right, this is the same data set shown across the different ethnic groups. You can see that across nearly all ethnic groups, sentiments are generally quite negative. There is a blip there with respect to Chinese respondents, and I think it's because of bias in the survey. We had some Malay respondents called Chinese respondents, so we will fix that. Next slide, please. What really is driving the negativity is that two factors. Number one is politics. The public is extremely upset that the politicians are unable to resolve things among themselves and behind closed doors. I think for many Malaysians, a lot of us abdicate our expectations and our responsibility to our leaders to sort it out. I bagi you kuasa, you settle lah among yourself, don't bother us lah, so you just settle among yourself, you just take care of the public services. I think that's the general sentiment out there. But when this dissension and arguments spread into the public space, people get upset, especially when suddenly they have to come up with another state election. So people are generally upset with that. And people are also upset because of this pandemic. So that's also another factor. The main driver of dissatisfaction about this pandemic, besides the human cost of the pandemic, is also the economic cost of it. And I will touch about that again at the end of this presentation, because so many people lost incomes. You know, in our population, I think between 10 to 15% of the people move segment from middle class to low income class, you know, because of the pandemic. And I would imagine some of the T20 became M40 as well because of that. And because of this pandemic and the clampdown it has had on economic activity and growth, our B40 is not B50, you know. So when we look at the data set, that's, I think, a big driver of unhappiness. Another factor, you know, besides the economic factors, is inflation. This inflation cut has been around for many, many years. You know, countries like Malaysia, trapped in the middle income zone, unable to move ahead. We have a wage squeeze in the sense that wages aren't rising fast enough as cost is rising. But because of uncertainties in the global markets, and now we have this war in Ukraine with the Russian invasion and all that, and the sanctions that are put in place, we can sort of see the effect that it's going to have, the chilling effect it's going to have on the economy. We will see that in our supermarket shelves very, very soon. And it's affecting different parts of the communities differently. Rural communities like my kampung in Sabak Bernam and others are very happy because CPO prices have shot through the roof. 6,500, 6,700 per ton. That's unprecedented. Way much better than 2004 when Pak Lah took over, and at that time when Pak Lah won 92% of the seats, CPO prices was only 4,500. I know this because my cousins in the kampung will, you know, normally update me on the prices because we have a small piece of palm oil land there. So we know what's going on there. And so this is going to affect the rural population very differently than the urban areas. Urban areas are going to be affected by food price increases and things like that. We also have to bear in mind that while Ukraine is very far away, Ukraine and Russia are big producers of wheat. It's going to affect flour and all that. So this is going to have a wider impact in the Middle East, in Europe and others, which I think will eventually flow back. The other reason why CPO prices went up is because Ukraine is the world's largest producer of sunflower oil. There's no more sunflower oil exports coming out from Ukraine, so that's driving up the prices of other types of vegetable oil like soy as well as palm oil. So all of this is going to affect the public, is going to affect the Malaysian public for a foreseeable future within this year. You know, so long as the conflict remains unresolved and infrastructure is destroyed over there. So I think for a good part, 2022 is going to be an inflation-ridden year. It's going to affect policymakers and government people in a very big way as it tries to dampen the effect on the Malaysian public. It's going to have an inordinately high impact on urban dwellers, which comes up to about 70% of our population, 70-75%. Next slide, please. So with respect to top issues, we have inflation. This is the survey done around Chinese New Year, so not very recent, so it's more than 6 weeks old now. Inflation, political instability, COVID is still there. At the time when we did the survey, COVID numbers were still low. It's not 30 over 1,000 as what we are experiencing right now. So we suspect that these numbers are going to go high as well. Next slide, please. So that's a kind of contemporary view. There's more stuff on that. Feel free to ask later. But I just want to focus on what are the underlying factors that underpin our politics, because it is a discussion about that, right? I think number one, as Hilmi and I think all of us are well aware, is identity politics is very important. It's shaped by our political geography, our very ethnically defined political constituencies, Malay seats, Chinese seats, mixed seats, Iban seats, Kadazan seats, and also Bidayu seats and all that. So that's all going to be part and parcel. And political parties are also organized to represent the different ethnic groups that make up our population. You have that. Number two is mindset, and also maybe the political, cultural orientation of our population. How does the public view power sharing amongst the elites? We know that in Malaysia, there is a distance between ordinary people and that of the elites. A lot of ordinary people, like I said earlier, abdicate authority, abdicate responsibility to leaders to decide for themselves. But there is a limit to that. There is a limit, and the limit represents what kind of parameters they ascribe to leaders to be able to share power, compromise, and form a government and things like that. Third is our views on democracy. Since this is also touching on that subject, I thought I would share some data there. And finally, the socio-economic imbalances that actually underpin everything. Right, next slide, please. Right, so back in 2020, in the middle of 2020, we actually did a field survey. So we went interview in the field. So during the gaps between the MCOs, we actually were able to, I think, interview about 2,000, I can't remember, 2,000 people face-to-face, 18 years old and above, to talk to them about what their views are about democracy, politics, other issues like gender and others. So it's a full-blown study there, which we're happy to discuss at another juncture. But I think the one thing that I wanted to share with you is that we tried to put together a typology, a kind of segmentation of Malaysian voters, a simple one at this, in order to see how they are orientated. So what we have here are the questions that we use and the methodology with which we segregated or segmented our respondents. Next slide, please. So here, it doesn't show up very well because of the color codes. But what you can see is that when we analyze the subjects, the respondents in the survey, we can generally split them into 5 segments. And these 5 segments, if you can see on the screen, is represented by those numbers. That's kind of moving outwards on a 45-degree angle from the bottom left-hand corner all the way to the right-hand corner. So those are the segments. The segments is arranged along a matrix, a grid somewhat. The vertical axis represents people's value systems. Do they have a more traditional, more conservative outlook? Or do they have a more liberal, more maybe, I wouldn't say modern, but yeah, a bit more modernist outlook? And on the left and right, horizontal axis is whether or not they see things from a mono-ethnic point of view or they embrace multiculturalism on the right-hand side. So we can see that for many Malaysians, most people are actually on the left-hand side. I don't quite like it because actually, okay, go back. Yeah, just remain here. So a lot of people are actually on this axis, and you have 48% that is on the bottom left-hand corner. So these are people who predominantly Malay. They want to see a country that is dominated by Malay political parties that represent their interests and decidedly have a more Malay-centric orientation. You have about 12% down there that's more conservative, that definitely wants to have a very Malay Muslim orientation there. But when we add the two numbers together, 60% of the electorate generally favor a more mono-ethnic perspective in terms of political orientation. So that makes it very hard to have a multicultural, more liberal platform with Malaysians out there to sell that to the other members of the public, in part because most people actually belong in the group. The group that's in the middle, about 17%, that's sort of straddling both, it's actually quite an interesting mix. It's a mix of different ethnic groups. About 40% Chinese, 30%, 20% Malay, large numbers of Indian communities are there. So that represents the people that are willing to compromise, they can accept multiculturalism, but at the same time they recognize the need to have a distinct Malay identity and flavor towards our politics. So that's a segmentation, okay? So I think it's not important to, you can look at the notes later, but it's just to see the shape, that most people are on the bottom, more conservative, more mono-ethnic perspective. The guys that are on the right-hand side to the top, more liberal, more embracing of multiculturalism, are almost all non-Malays. A small number of Malays there. Okay, next slide. So about political power sharing, we actually have quite a number of questions related to this, but I'm just putting across the simplest one. So we actually asked respondents, what kind of coalition would you like to run the country? Coalition of just Malay parties, coalition of non-Malay parties, coalition of parties representing all the groups, but the Malay party having a final say, kind of like Barisan Nasional, or even Perikatan Nasional. And you have a large number of Malays favouring that, 54%. 22% of Malays actually favour an all-Malay coalition, as what we saw, in the previous after 2020. So quite a large number of people are there, but large numbers of non-Malay voters, 92%, prefer a coalition of all parties, or each having equal say, kind of like a Pakatan Harapan type of outlook. So you can see that the views held by Malaysians are very dichotomous. It's very hard for them to find common ground in terms of what power sharing means. It's very clear that non-Bumiputras want equal say in the politics and policies of the country. But most Malays, I would say 70-80%, prefer Malay parties having the final say. So this is where we are at, the dichotomy that we experience here in Malaysia. Next slide. Some snippets on attitudes of democracy. By and large, most Malaysians generally accept democracy as the one system that can help us run this country. But when we look at democracy effectiveness, there are some, I think, question marks. We have, if you look at the first set of bar charts at the bottom there, we have a question. Only 53% of the people says that under a democratic system, the country's economic performance is improving. We have only 41% feel that even if the government cannot solve the country's economic problems, it still matters to be democratic. So we can see that, for many people, they like democracy, but they have questions whether democracy is effective in solving the problems faced by society. And if you look at the other principles of democracy, most people agree that they are participating in elections regularly. They think they generally have equal rights. They think that they're fairly treated. We have some rule of law. But when it comes to involving citizens in decision making, then the views are more contested, only about 52%. And we also have, I think we say contested views about having many political parties. So this whole thing about fragmentation, I think people like the idea of having a contest, but not too much, because then you no longer have competitive politics. That's, I think, what I want to offer here. That I think people like the idea that, okay, you have two coalitions, but once it becomes three, as what we've seen in the state elections that have taken place, it no longer becomes competitive. So, right, so the next slide. This is my last bit about underlying factors, and I think I want to say this because a lot of times we talk about the big issues, but I think we sort of forget to talk about the underlying issues, which is about demographics. And with respect to demographics, this is just Malay demographics, because when we look at things, the Malay community now is closely making up about 70% of the electorate, so they're going to chart the country's future. At the same time, their politics is very fragmented across so many different parties. If you look at where they're coming from, this is not the latest data, this is from 2019. 65% reside in urban areas, but urban seats only account for maybe about 55% or 60% of the seats in parliament. So there's still more seats that represent the rural population proportionately. So more seats represent the rural population as they do urban population, even though big majority of Malays already live in urban areas. Next slide, second slide on demographics. I know this is a bit busy, so it's a bit hard for you to peer into the numbers, but I think the focus is on the household decile group, the bottom colorful bar. I think just look at the red shaded areas. The red shaded areas are what we think to be the B40 group now. So in rural areas, you have nearly 80% of the population actually in the B40 group. So rural areas, mostly B40, overrepresented in the parliamentary districts. Urban areas is a bit more mixed, but underrepresented. But taken as a whole, this is just Malay demographics. Yeah, large numbers of Malays, about 65%, actually belong to the B40 group. Only about 35% are in the M40 or in the T20. So if we look at Klang Valley, it's not representative of the whole country. Perhaps the more representative area would be to go to Larut or go to even Tanjung Malim. Then maybe you get a more representative feel for the country. So that's why, notwithstanding politics and instability and narratives about court cluster and other things, the real issue is still the economy. And I think we have a challenging year ahead with respect to inflation, and that's going to affect things. So I think we go to my last part. I've taken so much of your time. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. If you can go to the next slide. Right, just a little bit about Sabah and Sarawak and Malacca elections. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is just looking at how Malay voters in Malacca voted. We think, it's just in our opinion, that the same pattern is going to show up in Johor as well. In part because the sentiments and the orientations of voters are not exactly alike, but somewhat similar. What happened in the November Malacca elections is that Pakatan Harapan lost 55% of their Malay votes, and these votes went to Perikatan Nasional. So this is an analysis of about 4,500 polling streams. We were able to get some of the data, we analyzed it and found the results. So Perikatan Nasional back in 2018 was just passed, so they got about 18% of the votes. But in 2021, in November, they got about nearly 35% of the votes. But what's interesting is that if you go deeper and look at the saluran, right, the streams, Perikatan Nasional actually got a bigger share of the youngest voters. Saluran 5, saluran 6 attained more Malay voters on that segment. More of them went to Perikatan Nasional than to BN or PH. So I think PH in some ways is really in trouble because they've lost not only their core votes, because their party split, their coalition split, so that took away more than half of their votes. So that's, I think, going to severely affect their prospects in future elections. Next slide. With respect to Chinese voters, I think the main thing here is the turnout. Turnout went down drastically, and I think same turnout pattern might be seen in Johor as well, because we know that people were saying, I don't have exact data here, but there's something like more 200,000 Chinese voters who work in Singapore, mostly Chinese, I would say 95% Chinese, who work and live in Singapore but vote in Johor. But we know from SPR data, only about 7,000 plus registered to vote by post. So you can sort of see the level of interest. We don't know. So we have to see this Friday whether there's going to be a jam at the highway or something, at the causeways and bridges, whether they are going to come back to vote. So we don't know. So, but we think that turnout is going to be low again, in part because many people have kind of resigned to the fact that the elections are not going to be very competitive, and it's not going to make a big difference. But for those that took the time to show up to vote, vast majority of them still voted for PH. So the actual voting pattern has not significantly shifted. It's stayed more or less the same, but it has been affected by turnout. Next slide. With respect to Sarawak, we saw the same patterns as well. So we know that PBB or GPS did very well. All of the component parties generally did very well. But when we go deeper and look into the details, actually for most of these parties actually didn't improve on their their actual support. The aggregate support remained the same. What really happened was the opposition split up. So like over here you have Perikatan Nasional coming up. Over there you have parties like PSB, PBK and others came up and took away votes from PKR, from DAP, and allowing those parties like SUPP to perform quite well. But in terms of actual support, SUPP actually didn't increase the number of actual votes. It's just that the opponents lost their votes to new emerging parties. Right, so I'll come to my concluding points on Outlook. So next slide, please. Next slide. I think what we are seeing with respect to national politics, I think is going to be colored by two things. Number one, it would be, how will the current coalitions, realign or reorientate itself? We have a situation where we have Prime Minister, which is leading the government, but it's not the president of the party. So there's question marks in terms of when or how elections are going to be called. To what extent he has latitude to do things as opposed to that by the party's leadership. So we know there's some dissension there. Number two, we also know that the opposition is also in a bit of a fragmented situation. While Perikatan Nasional is in government, they are clearly in the opposition when it comes to elections. So they are going to be on the back foot. The big question mark is, can anything be done? Can they find it within themselves to overcome the perceived hurt and egos and also betrayals or all these emotive aspects to find a way to put together so that at least we have competitive elections? And I think finally, it's a bit hard to predict the outcome right off the bat because there are still so many factors that are in the way. Number one, election timing. Number two, the composition of the parties themselves, the alignment of the parties. Number three, the key personalities at play. For example, we think that if UMNO retains the present lineup, it's going to generate a different outcome than if they were to put across a new lineup, new faces leading the party. It might be better they put new faces, but we don't know. So that has to do with timing. So a lot of questions in the air. If you look at the results of the recent Malacca elections and potentially this weekend's election, it may seem that there is a psychological momentum in favor of Barisan Nasional and all that. But when you look deeper, it may be that they didn't really improve significantly on the numbers of voters and that instead they are relying on their opponents being fragmented. So if the opponents have it within themselves to find a way to cooperate, then we might have a different outcome. Next slide. So we have questions about the next GE where, we have, let me just get to my notes. Number one, voter composition with the new voters, how are they going to vote? So Johor is going to be the litmus test. We suspect turnout is still going to be quite depressed. In fact, because most people, most of the younger people don't quite trust politicians, and then because of COVID and the restrictions, it's much harder to reach out to voters. And finally, the lineup as well, like who's on offer, who's going to lead, that's not very clear. So that's one thing. The other part is whether the elections in Johor as well as Malacca that we've seen is going to be predictive of the future. I've said a number of things, about personalities, party lineups and all that. But beyond that, if you look at the just basic patterns, I think the youth vote, will still, for the most part, maintain the same kind of orientation, that is voting along ethnic lines. It's just that the proportions will be different. We think that more of younger Malay voters will opt for new parties like MUDA, for example. But the general tendency to vote for ethnic-based parties is still there. In part because it's much harder for new parties as well as existing multicultural parties like PH to reach out to young people over the last 2 to 3 years. And number three, it's also because the difficulty in reaching out to them, and also the difficulty within the coalition itself. The coalition itself is in a state of flux. So that, I think, is a challenge in reaching out to young people and getting them to participate. The other point about new voters is that some are new, 18 to maybe 21, 25 years old. Others are much older. They were eligible even in 2014 but didn't take the trouble to register. Now they are automatically registered. So we suspect within this group, turnout rate is still going to be significantly lower. So how is it going to change politics? I think politics is going to be driven by appealing to party stalwarts, party hardcore voters. So those people who are already known to be supporting parties, they will be mobilized to come out to vote. The turnout rate there is probably in excess of 90%. So, and UMNO has a long tradition and capacity to mobilize the support. I think we will see that at play this weekend, and they will turn out their supporters, and they still have sizable support in Johor. Next slide. So things to look out for, I think in the near term, will be intra-UMNO stability. How will things line up? Is the party approaches party elections towards the end of this year? Will the current leadership be retained? Will new people vie for the presidency of the party? That's going to color public perceptions about the party and the direction it takes. COVID infection rates, although we think that we are going into endemic stage now, still, a lot of cases, millions of people have been affected, and that's still going to affect voter turnout and voters' participation in political events. And I think third point is economic growth, still very important, and how well the government manages inflation as it hits us in the wallets in the coming months. And finally, opposition. Will the opposition be able to work together and find a way to place one candidate against Barisan Nasional as opposed to 4, 5, 6, 7 candidates? And last slide, please. election timing, I think I just want to say that on the ground, as you can see in the first slide, which talks about the public mood and direction, mood's quite negative. It's been affected by the floods, and now we have inflation coming up, and people are generally unhappy with how the government is managing the economy. Even if they win Johor, that's not going to change the inflation outlook. That's not going to change public perceptions of government. So how will they be able to overcome that if they have early elections? So in terms of election timing, we think that it could be as early as the middle of this year when the MOU between the opposition and government expires. And if, let's say Barisan does well in this Johor election, then they might have the psychological boost they need in order to dissolve parliament. Or if the Prime Minister probably has his way, he'll try to take it to the fullest extent of his term and have it at the second half next year. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Ben, for sharing with us, or basically illuminating on the landscape, the political landscape that we are facing. And it ties very nicely to what we're going to have discussed next with Kira Yusri, who's online with us. Basically, Kira will elaborate. Kira, are you there? Yeah. Okay, Kira, so one of the questions that perhaps based on what was shared by Ben as well, on the impact of Undi 18 and the automatic registration, how does, or basically what can you expect in terms of the challenges that perhaps, so for example, the imbalances across certain constituencies, right, or the limitations of the electoral system? Perhaps you can share with us on those, and what can we advocate for, or what must the EC address in terms of prior, when we line up to GE15. Over to you, Kira.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I hope you can hear me well. I'm sorry, I'm already in Johor in preparation for the elections. I've been here for the past week and a half. It's been very interesting to shadow the candidates and to just go down to the ground, especially talking to the young people here as well. I think some of the challenges that, I mean, even just seeing and talking to the young people here that will face is very similar to what Ben has actually highlighted in his research and in data. Number one, many people don't know that they actually qualify to vote. You know, I think even though the Undi 18 constitutional amendment was passed almost 2 years ago, the implementation is less than 6 months ago. It was implemented on December 15th, and then only in January that people could actually check their voter registration status. And even then, we had to really push and encourage people to inform them that they now qualify to vote. Many of the people that we meet here didn't even know that they now qualify. They still think it's 21 years old and above, or even if they were unregistered before, they don't know that they are already automatically registered. And as I understand, EC's job is certainly to promote and inform the public that they are now eligible to vote. And if you go down to the ground, if you go into the interior areas, so we visited some Felda areas and all that, there is no offline information whatsoever that elections are happening soon. There is no promotion by the EC that you can check your voters registration status, election dates are what date. Many people that we speak to don't even know that elections are happening. And so it's very concerning in the lack of interest or desire to participate in the state elections. And I think I would also attribute this to, especially among young people, is that the voter apathy is at all-time high because, number one, they don't trust political institutions, they don't trust political parties anymore. They don't trust that their votes will be counted, their votes will be accounted for or taken seriously. And as a young person myself, it's very hard to convince them otherwise as well, right? There's only so much you can say that you still have to trust the system, you still have to believe in the system, which brings me back to the system, right? At the moment, elections, because of the pandemic, has become very inaccessible to many people. Looking at how even the Malacca elections, it is not easy if you are unvaccinated, if you are close contact, which at that time you were, now the restrictions has lifted for close contact, but back then it was not lifted. And then also if you are COVID positive, it's very difficult for you to go and vote. They don't make the instructions clear, they don't publicize it properly, and they don't make accommodations for people to turn out and vote as well. Not to mention, because of COVID, the logical, I think, one improvement that the EC had done was to allow to more categories of people to do postal voting. But even then, especially in the Johor elections where Undi 18, we're trying our best to mobilize postal voters. It is very difficult still because one, many people don't know how to register as a postal voter. The process is not easy. The date and the time to register as a postal voter also is very short. So we had to really, I felt like, the EC was not very proactive in encouraging people to register as a postal voter. And Ben is right, there were 200,000 Johorian voters based in Singapore. And these voters could, if they can't travel back due to limited VTL slots, it's a waste if their voices are not counted in the state election. At the moment, there are almost 7,000 plus postal voters registered in Singapore. On Undi 18 side, we have identified and collected almost 5,000 ballots to be brought back physically because we feel like some of them, although residing in Johor, residing in Singapore, have still not received their postal ballots yet. So I think there's definitely a lot of areas of improvement that the EC can look into when it comes to increasing access to elections. But I think the most important part is that actually what is the EC doing? I think they're not very transparent in the work that they've done so far. One of the very simple ways I think to look around that is that can we put EC under the purview of Parliament? I think to really scrutinize and hold them accountable to the work that they've done. So I think and I think just commenting quickly on the Johor state elections that are coming up, I'm very worried and very concerned that young people will not turn out to vote, considering that many people are not able to come back. We have a high number of applications of young people requesting financial support to return back to Johor and cast their vote. So while it's heartening to see there's an interest, there is definitely, it's not, but there's not much accommodation or support we can provide to them unless, we can subsidize or cover everyone's costs. And then, of course, the second part that it's much harder to beat is the interest and desire to participate in elections. Although I think, one on the flip side is that one positive aspect of the Undi 18 implementation before the Johor state elections is that I think almost every party is putting forward fresh faces or new candidates. Ironically, Barisan Nasional, always touted the Grand Old Party, is putting forward the youngest candidate this election of 26 years old. And I think we see many entrants of new parties as well with Muda and also Warisan in the state elections. I don't know how this, and of course, I think Parti Bangsa Malaysia as well. But as someone, I've seen the vibe and the hype of like the general election in 2018. You don't feel the same hype right now on the ground. So I'm not sure if it's because we are just tired. I think it's very exhausting. I think for if even for us as political commentators to follow the drama and to follow the political instability that's going on, I think it's much worse for an average citizen. And it's very confusing for a voter to make their decision. So I think that's also one of the, there's things to look forward to and things to be happy about. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot more pressing and concerning matters when it comes to political participation, especially from young people in this election. And not to mention, there are many rumors as well that if, depending on how the results of Johor election, they might call a general election. So, and when we talk about this with young people, the only response we usually get is like, oh my God, not again. One more time, we have to go through this all over again. So I think it's very, I don't think it's very healthy for us to constantly go through multiple elections like this. But I think that's again one of the flaws I think in the system that that we need to, I guess, if we are serious about reforming it, is that how do you actually, if we are to have these mechanisms and all that, how do we actually still support and maintain the numbers for political participation?
Thank you, Kira, for your inputs and sharing. Basically, that nicely fits into what we're going to have from Thomas coming back on the stage. Thomas will be talking about institutional reform. And basically, Thomas, can you share with us some of your findings, with Bersih being one of a very prominent civil society organization that has done a lot of materials on the significance of institutional reform being carried out post GE15 scenario. We have a lot of anticipation of having mixed governments or a post-electoral pact being formed. We also have an idea that weaker governments might emerge. So could you share with us, in terms of the democratic awareness that is available in the public sphere based on the observation, and can we sustain institutional reform in the long term? Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon to everyone. Yes, I think our interest really, when it comes to politics and election, are institutional reforms, electoral reforms, because these are the systems that allow political parties to compete with each other, hopefully in a fair ways. And I think from what we are seeing right now, the playing field is not level, and certainly there are many loopholes in our political system. So what's been happening since the Sheraton move, I think really exposes the weaknesses that we have in our system. We had 3 prime ministers in as many years, and we had 8 change of state government, including the Johor one, due to a large part directly or indirectly to party hopping. And I think this sort of situation cannot be resolved through snap election. We are seeing in Johor, Malacca, and Sabah, because whenever you have a situation where the majority of the winning coalition is not as strong, and also another factor where the relationship between the coalition partners are not strong because they have competing interests, like what we are seeing right now. At the start of the Sheraton move, there was a lot of jubilation that you have a Malay unity government for the first time. Bersatu, PAS, and UMNO together in government. But very soon after, they realized that they are actually competing for the same electoral seats. And therefore, something need to give way, something need to be sorted out. And then you have also, during the Pakatan government, whereby they are together, but they have conflicting ideologies and interests. And that also caused that situation. So if we go to G15, what will be the outcome? We do not know. You know, a lot of it does. The Johor election will be a foreshadow of the likely situation for G15. But even if there is a strong government being elected for G15, there's no guarantee that there will be stability or reform. Okay, so I think when it comes to institutional reform, we find that actually when there is no strong government with a strong super majority, the condition for reform is actually best. Because what we are seeing right now, where we have the memorandum of understanding signed between the Ismail Sabri government and the PH government, this came about not because of strength or because of political will, but a political desire to be in power. And as a result, they reach out to the opposition for a confidence and supply agreement type of agreement for stability. So we feel that if there is a strong government after G15, then less likely we'll see reform. So in some way, it's in our interest that we see this fragmentation, but it will force the party to reach out to each other. Even if they have a majority, they will not feel very secure, but they will probably need to sign CSA with each other. And that would mean reforms for us. So that is, I think, something that is going to be probably a new norm in Malaysian politics that will perhaps open the way for reforms that will strengthen our political system in the country. And I think the other thing that we want to look at are what are some of these reforms that are important, in the build-up to G15. The MOU has already listed some of these reforms, like the anti-hopping law, which could be tabled this very week itself and passed into law in this month as well. And then along with that, there will be parliamentary reform, which will be coming up. Now, this is very important for us as a nation. Our parliament has to be more than a rubber stamp to the executive, where parliamentarians in the opposition bench and backbench have very little role to play, other than to voice their dissatisfaction angrily across the aisle. But in a functioning parliament, there will be a lot of select committees, parliamentary select committees, where bills, laws, and policies could be discussed and fine-tuned before they are brought to the floor for debate. Now, this is happening under Pakatan Harapan. They have started the process and continue even under Perikatan Nasional and now. But we have not seen the select committee really functioning the way it should be functioning as a select committee, to scrutinize the laws that will be coming forward, to be able to summon civil servants and ministry to query them. So we want to see a strengthened parliament, and parliamentary reform is part of the package of the MOU, where we will see the formation of up to 15 parliamentary select committees, and also the return of the Parliamentary Services Act. What that means is that Parliament will have its own budget to function. Parliament will be able to hire their own staff. Parliament will be able to fund some of the research needed so that the select committees could function effectively. So this needs to be in place before G15. But we also hope that if there is an extension, a delay in implementing G15 to next year, middle of next year, that political financing reform also will be on the table for implementation. Then also the AGC, Attorney General Chambers reform, where the role of the Attorney General is separated from that of the public prosecutor. And lastly, when it comes to any election, the role of the EC is crucial. And what we really need to see is an EC that is progressive, an EC that is aggressive, to pursue better ways to give people access to voting. I totally agree with what Kira said, The EC is underperforming in this election. And we are seeing that people are not even aware of Undi Post, how to apply and what is the process. And with the increased implementation of Undi 18 and automatic voter registration, the biggest challenge that EC have right now is voters turnout. Now, I want to give you a figure that will shock probably all of you. My estimation of the Johor election voter turnout is that it will be less than 50%. Less than 50%. Simply because with Undi 18 and AVR, we saw the electoral roll jump from 1.8 at the last election to almost 2.6 million in Johor right now. Now, at the last election, 1.33 million Johorans came out to vote. And now, if the same number came out to vote this time, under the new electoral roll, we would only have just over 51% voter turnout. Now, is that likely? The same enthusiasm as we had for G14? Not likely. But yes, we have more young voters. But I think as analyzed and the feedback on the ground, many are still not aware and many may not come out to vote. But it's a challenge from now on, not just for Johor, but for the next GE, for EC to raise the voter turnout to at least 60%. And what are they going to do about it? They have to provide better processes for absentee voting through postal voting or advanced voting, because people need to be aware, they need to be able to access voting station or means of voting. And for this to happen, we need an EC that is more reform-minded, an EC that is accountable to Parliament, as mentioned by Kira. Under our proposal is a select committee for electoral matters in Parliament to have oversight over the EC, rather than the EC functioning as a department under the Prime Minister's department. So that's an issue. The other big issue and challenge that EC has now is the issue of delineation of boundaries. Now, we already have one of the world's worst electoral boundaries in terms of malapportionment. With only 18 and automatic voter registration, that problem just gotten worse, much worse. So take, for example, in Selangor, the biggest seat in Selangor is the parliament seat of Bangi. Right now, before the implementation of Undi 18 and AVR, GE14, it had about just under 180,000 voters. Now it has 300,000 voters. And Sabah Bernam had about 40,000. Now it has just over 50,000. This disparity between Sabah Bernam, your seat, Ben, and Bangi is about 6 times, more than 6 times. And something has to be done. A delineation needs to be triggered to rectify this. But I want to say a delineation does not guarantee fair boundaries, because if EC is not independent, they will continue to malapportion. So that's all I think I want to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for that insight. And we've gone through this session by having Ben talking about the landscape. We have Kira talking about youth participation, and we also have Thomas talking about electoral reforms. So it all comes down to how we hope to have a better electoral outcome for GE15. And now I'll invite my co-moderator, Mr. Zenteng, to basically stick out some of the questions that I'm sure a lot of the audience at home, and we can also have questions from the hall, to basically touch on or ask our panelists on their views on the entire outlook that we're going to have, and basically on their presentations. Over to you, Zenteng.
Thank you, Helmi, and thank you all speakers for your very interesting insights and findings. The first question is directed to Kira. So I believe that all eyes are on the upcoming Johor State election this Saturday. So what is the expected impact of the election on G15 and Malaysia's politics in general?
I'm on this aspect, I'm very conservative. I don't believe that the youth vote in Johor will make a very big impact. But just because I think it's very hard for them to come out and vote. So I think I agree with Ben's prediction earlier that I think they won't vote drastically different, and also on another hand is that they won't come out to vote. So I think the question then to add on to that is to everyone else is also to what can we do in the meantime to close that gap between the Johor state elections and the general elections, no matter when that is. Yeah, because I genuinely don't think that it's gonna make as big of a splash as we hope to be, or for me at least, just because it's been implemented too close to elections. There has not been enough time to mobilize young people. There's not enough time to actually engage and get them excited about the idea of elections and politics in time for these elections. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Kira. So I have a next question. This is for Ben. So from the survey results that you showed just now, it's shown that like citizens think that we are actually headed to a wrong direction due to political instability. But some say that like this kind of instability that we experienced in the past is actually a sign of democracy growing in Malaysia. But some say that, as we saw just now, some are actually very concerned about the future of the nation. So in face of this contested view on democracy, how can we draw the line between disruption and development in our democracy?
Yeah, thanks. I think what we're seeing in Malaysia right now is a kind of transition from a dominant, single-party dominant era or period of time into one where you might have emerging parties that are trying to also place themselves in the political arena. So the long time, 6-decade-long rule of Barisan Nasional as the main dominant party, I think that spell has been broken, and voters are now looking at what else is on offer, what new parties are there, what do they bring to the equation that can solve the problems of the country. Second, I think the context of democracy or this appreciation for democracy is still there. I would say vast majorities of nations still believe that democracy is the best system there is in order for us to choose leaders and government. But of course, it is a contested view in terms of how effective it is in solving problems, in terms of representing the will of the people. But beyond that, I think what we are seeing with the changes in the electoral demographics, with Undi 18 and automatic voter registrations, the demographics are changing along with the country's own population demographics. I think that in time, there will be some kind of stability. We are not there yet. We are still in a flux because it is a transition period. At some point, things ought to settle down and then reach a more stable situation where clearly certain parties will realign themselves in new coalitions that can offer, I would say, more competitive elections, more tangible outcomes. My hope, and this is not just hope, but I think in the numbers as well, with the change in the demographics, in the sense that you have higher numbers of Bumiputra voters in the electoral roll right now, be it that at this point in time, maybe many are not aware that they're eligible to vote, but this all will change over time. And with declining government control over media, people will be able to think for themselves. And this allows for better appreciation of or debate over policies and public service delivery. And so I think along with the decline of single party dominant rule, we also have, I would say, the decline in the government's ability to just shape the narratives because they are able to address the socio-economic imbalances in the public space, like what I've shown in the presentation earlier. Because for the longest time, we have a very strong subsidy regime. I just do not see the subsidy regime remaining in place in the same way it is into the medium term, into the future. Things will have to change in order to accommodate all of the changes and developments that the government needs to keep abreast in order to keep Malaysia competitive.
All right, thank you, Ben, for your response. I have one question from our online audience. This will be directed to Mr. Thomas. So, what do you think of the upcoming anti-hopping law? How does it affect the country's political development after the G15?
Yes, it has been promised that the anti-hopping law will be tabled in Parliament this very week and will be passed by the end of this sitting. To me, this is a very significant amendment because we know that what happened even before Sheraton move, but the acceleration of political instability that took place after Sheraton move really is due to, in a large part, party hopping. the passing of these amendments to the Constitution to basically stop party hopping, I think it's going to have a very strong psychological effect on Malaysian voters in general, because already most of them are so disillusioned and disenchanted with what has been happening for the past 2 over years. And just this one amendment, I think, will restore hope and confidence in some of these Malaysians that it is still worthwhile to come out and vote. You know, that their vote is not just going to be so easily overturned, you know. The choice of government that they elected is just not going to be so easily overturned through party hopping. So this is something that is important. Now, what is going to be tabled, we think, will be the traditional anti-hopping law. So to illustrate the importance of this, if we go back to the Sheraton Mall, and if we had this anti-hopping law, what it would mean, first of all, is that Asmin Ali and the 10 who defected or left PKR with him, they would have to vacate their seat. There will be a by-election straight away, but they will be able to contest in the same seat. In other words, returning to the voters, their voters, for a fresh mandate to support what they did to leave PKR or to be sacked from PKR. But if the people do not support their action, then the seat will be won back by PKR. But what this anti-hopping law would not deal with is when a party like Bersatu chose to leave the coalition. So what happened at Sheraton Mall? Muhyiddin Yassin would not, and his party MPs would not lose their seat. But Tun Mahathir and the 5 or 6 who chose not to go along with them, they would lose their seat and have to recontest to see whether their voters support them. You know, so that will be the situation with this current anti-hopping law that we in place. To us, it's not an ideal solution. We prefer a more nuanced solution, a more where we recall election, where the voters actually do a petition to decide whether the MP should lose a seat or not. But having said that, it's better to have an anti-hopping law than no law at all going into GE15. So we welcome it.
All right, thank you so much for that. The next question is actually for all of the panelists, so anyone can feel free to take that question. So like, we talk a lot about like institutional level of reforms and also what EC can do, how Parliament can be reformed. But how about the people and the voters in the upcoming election? What should we do after this talk, after we realize much reforms are needed? What should the rakyat prepare themselves for in the upcoming election? Yeah.
Anyone want to go? Okay, Ben first. Yeah.
Take a step at that. I think the public is looking for leadership that can actually steer the country away from the doldrums and stagnation. We've lost, as a country, I think we've lost so much time. We've lost so much time since, I would say, the middle of 2015, ever since the 1MDB news broke and, investors and other international attention on Malaysia has turned negative. And as a trading nation, we need to fix the narrative again. It doesn't help if we have a general election and the general election doesn't provide us with a strong result that can at least ensure stability and predictability moving forward. We also, I think, increasingly living in a very more competitive neighborhood, both economically and geopolitically. What's happening in Europe certainly will have lessons and ramifications over here. I doubt that with the current, infighting and politicking over seats in Johor, and that's going to, whatever that's happening in the world is going to be very high on the radar of our policymakers and our leaders right now. And that's, I think, a shame, because we really need to tool up. So I think as members of the public, I think they need to work with civil society to pressure political parties to act more responsibly, to find ways to build bridges and provide a more competitive election in the upcoming general election. They need to reassess whether or not they want to be in the CSA or the MOU beyond the necessary time period, because if the reforms are carried through, then that's fine. If it is not carried through, then we are back to where we were before. But what's more important is that they need to fix their own internal house in order so that they can come back to the public and present the public with a new set of goals that the public can rally around. And this works for all three major sides, for Perikatan, for Barisan Nasional, as well as Pakatan Harapan. As things currently stand, we have a situation where we are not going to have competitive elections. It may end up with a hung parliament where no single coalition covers a majority, has a strong majority. They need to build coalitions with Sabah, with Sarawak, and that puts them hostage to Sarawak in its demands for more autonomy and more control. The concern is that over time, as the centre becomes weaker, then the periphery is just going to pedal their way away from the centre and start to do their own thing. And that I think is a bad thing in a country like Malaysia, for us to lose control. And then I think finally, it's for civil society, I think, to really go to the ground and speak to people, young people, as well as those who are older but previously not eligible, and educate them about the need to participate in elections and demand better quality leadership from the political parties that claim to represent them. I think it's time for the tables to be turned so that politicians are held to account for what they're trying to do. Because I think we've looked at Malacca and the lack of competitiveness there. Look at Johor, and I think if the same pattern emerges in the national general elections in the near future, then we are going to see another 5 years of directionless and weak government.
Would Thomas or Kira like to also posit some thoughts? Okay, Thomas first. Man.
Okay, yeah, good question. What should voters be looking out for? I think this time, on the menu, there are so many choices, so many options, and for some people it's confusing who to choose, who to back, compared to the last election. But I would say, look for the party that truly committed to the institutional reforms. Now, it may not sound like a very exciting, sexy word, institutional reform, but I can say that it is totally relevant and important to all of us who desire to see political stability and greater accountability, of our politicians to us. And right now, we do not have both. We do not have stability. We do not have accountability. And how do we fix that? We fix that by coming out with laws, amendment to laws or new laws that would give us that aspect, stabilize the political system. So anti-hopping law is one of those law that is needed to stabilize the situation. But we also need more accountability. We need a MACC that is independent, that is able to deal with the issue of corruption without fear or favor. And how do you do that? You have to basically remove the role, the control of MACC from that of the Prime Minister, and empower it, so that it can truly be independent. So there are many other reforms needed. Now, how do you know the party? You the party need to state clearly the institutional political reform that they are prepared to commit to in the manifesto. And then we hold them to account for that. Now, there are perhaps party that feels that it's not wise, it's not good to make very clear commitment to reforms in their manifesto because they may not be able to fulfill it. But I would say that their inability to fulfill it is not because of anything, but because of their own political will. Now, when people go to vote at the ballot box, they may not understand all the legal jargon about institutional reform. But if a party is willing to state clearly this is what they are committed to, political financing reform, AG reform, and local council elections or whatever, people will have a sense that they are voting for real change. It's not same. I vote for this party, they sound the same as the other party, and therefore no change. So why should I change? I just stick with the status quo, you know. So I want to challenge all political parties, compete with each other over the reforms. You know, we want to vote for parties that are very clear about the kind of reforms they want. So choose those parties and also look at the candidates. Look for candidates who have a clean history, doesn't have a history of betrayals and corruption or question of corruption. So this is what we must do, but we must vote. Because if we don't vote, change will not come. If we vote, we may see some change. But change is a long-term process. It's not dependent on one election, but it's many elections and us not giving up.
Kira, would you like to also add to what Ben and Thomas has mentioned? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think maybe just a quick one. Hopefully there are young people my age or younger watching this conference today. And I think I'll be speaking to them. I think young people are always asking, what can we do to demand better change? What can we do to see a better Malaysia? And because I think we've grown up in a Malaysia where like asking questions are not allowed and not encouraged, challenging norms and ideas, contributing ideas are not necessarily accepted or welcome. So I think in this new age or new world where, you know, Undi 18 is a reality, where students are allowed to join politics, high school students are allowed to hold student elections. You know, I think young people need to look around us and ask ourselves, what are the issues that makes us angry? What are the issues that makes us, what are the problems around our community, our family, ourselves that are important to us? And then think about how can we actually change that kind of situation. You know, there are many ways to create change. Joining politics is one of them. Becoming politically active is one of them. You know, and it's important to understand and realize that for many issues in Malaysia, political will is needed to change the tide. Political will is needed to solve those problems. And as you know, the other points I've mentioned, to push for these reforms. So as young people, it's very important that we educate ourselves by understanding the issues and trying to think of what are the solutions required. Is it passing the laws at the state or federal level? Is it, you know, understanding the agencies involved? Is it, you know, sometimes even going out to protest and making your voices heard? And of course, the most important one is actually getting out and vote. So for me, you know, my personal journey in political advocacy didn't start until I became very angry about it as an issue. And I think that's probably the same across many activists and many advocates out there. So it's important for, you know, for us, this generation and the next one, I say, to question the environment around us and think constructively, how do we improve it beyond just, you know, knowing that there is a problem. Yeah. Thanks, Helmi.
Yeah, do we have any more questions, Zinting? We do still have about 5 to 10 minutes because we did start late. So would there be any questions, or we can go to the concluding remarks? Zinting, any questions more?
Actually, we received quite a lot of interesting questions, but I think we cannot address them all due to time constraint for now.
Right.
So, but to all of you who submitted, sorry. Okay, we actually can allow one more question. Give me 1 minute. Yeah, all right. Actually, so I wanted to take this chance to direct this question to Kira as well. So, as a first-time youth voter myself, how can I encourage my friends, especially in the semi-urban or rural youth who are politically apathetic, to get involved in the democratic process? And what is a suggestion on how we can do this to empower people around us to vote?
And Kira,
Yeah, I
before
think-
Kira, hold that thought. Before you answer, perhaps you can also give your remarks and the concluding remarks as well on that question, and for the rest of the panelists as well, on do you see representative style democracy being shifting or evolving into a more deliberative style of democracy in our country? So, and your concluding remarks as well, Kira. Over to you, and then we'll pass over to Thomas and end with Ben. Over to you, Kira.
Yeah, thanks, Helmi. I think I'll answer that question first. So I think Malaysia has not had many chances to experience deliberative democracy, and I don't think our system necessarily facilitates that in a good way either. I think representative democracy, we are still struggling with it being truly representative. Beyond just like having MPs and Dewan Rakyat voted in and all that. So I think if we are transitioning, I don't think it's happening very quickly. Although I recognize that there are efforts that's trying to push towards that, and I think it's a very healthy way to kickstart and push for discourse into looking into how our democratic systems are in Malaysia. But I think one of the challenges that they'll face, and even we face, is that the values of democracy is, like as Ben mentioned, is accepted. Of course, everyone accepts that on the surface level, yes, we do want democracy in Malaysia. I think the intricacies, the details of it is still not very appreciated by many people. But of course, it's what all of us here are doing, in our efforts in educating them on it. To answer the question about as a young person, what can I do for young people to get young people out to vote? I think similarly to what I've mentioned earlier, I always generally start by asking my friends and family, why don't you vote? Why is politics not important to you? And of course, they'll have their reasons, and most of the time it'll be because it's not trustworthy, it's not worth it, janji tak akan ditepati, and so on and so forth. I would usually respond with that, then if we don't participate, then that the problem will never end, right? I think that with marginalized communities, whether it's women, whether it's young people, the solution to our voices not being heard is taking up spaces on our own initiative. So I think for young people, if it's not easy to convince them that bread and butter issues can be linked to institutional reforms, but I think if we persist and we can easily show the link of how institutional reforms, like solving the issues of corruption, solving the issues of political funding and all that, can sort of like improve bread and butter issues, then I think people will be able to appreciate democracy and institutional reforms better, and won't come out and vote. So for example, just a very quick one, right? When I went to shadow a candidate a few days ago, and we went to a Felda area, you ask them what are the issues they care about the most, they will say rasuah. They just say rasuah. Saya tak nak lihat pemimpin saya ambil rasuah, pegang rasuah and all that. But obviously we did not have time to deep dive into institutional reforms and all that. But the awareness is there, right? There is a way to simplify and make institutional reforms understandable if we work at it. So I think that's a continuous effort that we all have to keep doing, whether it's think tanks, NGOs, politicians, because we cannot give up on educating people about these reforms and about aspiring for a better Malaysia.
Please, thank you, Kira. Please, Thomas, your concluding remarks and the question on deliberative democracy.
Yes, thank you. I think certainly there's a lot of problem with our parliamentary democracy, with the many weaknesses in the laws, But I think the focus has to be, how do we fix it? How do we strengthen our parliamentary democracy to the point that it is really functioning as a representative of the people. But also, I think we need to start bringing in elements of deliberative democracy, where the citizens can, directly, beyond just voting every 5 years, but directly engage with the political process, both in Parliament and outside Parliament. We need to look at ways, for example, like allowing some sort of petition that would trigger a discussion or debate on important issues that come up mid-term during the cycle of the Parliament. So we have to look at how we can improve our representative democracy and also include elements of deliberative democracy. But also, I think as a longer-term goal, we should start talking about modifying or changing our electoral system from the current first past the post that perhaps have served us well in the past, but now with the many fragmentation of parties into smaller parties, it is perhaps time to start looking at incorporating proportional representation so that every vote does count to decide the representation in the Parliament, instead of what we have right now. Because in a first past the post system, is the candidate who wins the most votes that get elected, even if in a multi-cornered fight like what we have. The winning candidate may be the candidate with 30% of the vote, and yet that person has been elected to represent the rest, and 70% of the people who voted didn't vote for this candidate. And so those 70% are wasted vote. So first past the post creates that. So I think as a longer goal, we as a nation, we need to start exploring and tailoring and engineering our electoral system to cater for the new political landscape that we have right now.
Thank you, Thomas. Ben, yes, your turn. On petitions, referendums, like Thomas was mentioning, budget participation from the public. Can you see that happening?
Yeah, I think there are steps that can be done to improve the quality of our democracy, in part because, we have a lot of tools that are already available right now. We have social media, we have means for people to participate in debates and for them to get informed if they wish to about important issues that affect their lives. I think on the topic of deliberative democracy, I think we can have small steps. But I think the important element that is needed here are courageous leaders who are confident about themselves and also what they offer to the public to begin the process. And it can begin at local levels. It can be an MP or even ADUN, a state councillor, and have town hall meetings to debate and discuss about important projects that the communities need. I think when we look at democracy here in Malaysia, the missing element is local government, local democracy. This has, been talked about for many years, and from our surveys, we know that vast majority of Malaysians actually support local government elections. Most people do not believe by having local elections is going to deepen or create more problems with politics. In fact, a lot of people feel that by having local citizens participate in elections at the local level, they then have more say over things and issues that affect them directly. In a lot of the surveys that we've done, we find that 60% of Malaysians, when they deal with government, actually they deal with local government. Most people don't deal with federal government or let alone the state government unless they have big transactions, they are trying to transfer a piece of property or something like that. Most people just deal with their local councils when they pay assessment tax, when they need a permit or license. And that's, I think, at the point where democracy needs to begin. And the democracy that can be done there at that level can be deliberative. It can be debates or discussion over important projects that the community needs. Because we do know that in terms of the processes, local government, is a bureaucracy here in Malaysia. you have councillors appointed by political parties. They may or may not reflect the wishes and the interests of the communities they claim to represent. There are also issues of integrity and whatnot over there as well. But when it comes to development, it's implemented by the bureaucracy. And again, what bureaucracy implements may or may not be what the public wants. And there's basically very little participation on the part of the public over how public funds are spent. And so discussions and debate over budgets to be spent at the local level can be part of a deliberative democracy process. It can be part where it can be an area where marginalized groups or other groups like communities like women, children, their interests are also taken care in terms of what's needed at the community level. I think here in Malaysia, there may not be many local councils or municipalities that have reached that level, but certainly in the urban areas where it's very well served by ICT, you might be able to have a process by which citizens can vote on initiatives or projects that can bring benefit to them, and they can pose questions. The most basic things would be having town hall meetings and all that. We've participated or helped organize those. But what we find is that the drawback, or rather the inertia against having things like this, is a lot of people are very do not want to face criticisms, because every time you have a town hall meeting, all kinds of stuff comes out, very uncomfortable stuff that the bureaucrats do not really want to face. So there has to be a process for which issues are debated, in a civic and very controlled manner, so that you can achieve specific outcomes. But I think key to all of this is having courageous leadership that's willing to try out new things. And I think for members of the public, we need to find a few leaders that are willing to test these methods and then give citizens a say over issues that affect their lives. I think finally, just as concluding remarks, I think we have a situation right now where you have large numbers of voters, but public interest in terms of participating is a bit low because of all the factors that I've talked about. But I think what's key is that the politicians and people who want to serve the public, want to become public servants and servants of the public, they really need to find out what the public really wants, and they need to find that emotional connection with voters again. And I think that connection has been lost over the last several years. I think a lot of parties have been affected by what they perceive to be betrayals, and there's always two sides to the stories, right? Betrayals and things like that, without truly reflecting their role in it. And I think there has to be a stock take in terms of what they can and cannot offer to the public. And I think to begin fixing it before the next election rolls by, because if not, we lose another 5 years. And I think by and large, Malaysians are increasingly becoming more gloomy about the outlook of the country. So because of that, I think it's going to affect our national potential as well.
Thank you so much, Ben, for closing the session. So thank you, Ben. Thank you, Thomas, for being here on stage. And thank you, Kira, for being online with us. And thank you to my co-moderator, Mrs. Henteng. So now I will pass over to Salsabila to basically adjourn for lunch and also share a bit on what's up next.
Yeah.
Over to you, Sally.
Okay, thanks, Halmi. Thank you to all our speakers, Mr. Ibrahim Sufyan, Mr. Thomas Fan, and also Ms. Kira Yusri for joining online. And thank you to our moderator, Mr. Halmi, as well as co-moderator Zanting from IDEAS.